like you said, I'm a city guy. I've been doing city stuff really since I was in college when I started a nonprofit in inner city Philadelphia doing economic development. And I did it from the public sector side in the mayor's office in DC, and now very much on the startup side in 1776, where I lead up all of our smart cities and transportation work. And I love it. It's a lot of fun. And it's interesting seeing that in the panel just now that concluded with the federal side, they started stealing our thunder a little bit and bleeding into local issues with Uber in New York and with Airbnb in San Francisco. And it's a little bit, it's not that surprising to me. I think back, because I think about these issues both from the public and startup side quite a bit. And I think a lot about a sort of beloved former mayor of Boston, Tom Menino. Anybody here from Boston by chance? No.
The Patriots are on 8:30, so
there you go.
They're not here tonight.
Touche, well played. But Menino was mayor for approximately forever, and he liked to say that cities are the first responders, and what he meant by that was that it's the federal government and the states where you're really legislating, but at the city level, you're the one as mayor, as a city official, you have to deal with the crap that's happening right then and there. You're the one that has to deal with a recession first because you're seeing your unemployment payouts go up. You're the one that has to deal with a public health crisis, a plague, God forbid, because you're seeing more people come to your hospitals with things you can't diagnose. Basically, as a city, you're about managing things, making people's lives better day to day, and keeping the city afloat. And when you think about a city in that way, which I, by the way, endorse, we'll see if the panelists agree. You think about what a startup that matters about. A startup that matters is really about solving a problem for people's lives day to day. It's not about legislating usually. So, but it's not surprising that the startups that matter, that come to mind first, are probably going to be startups like Airbnb and Uber, that are going to be really engaging primarily at the local level. But of course I say this because I'm a cities person, this is what I get excited about. So that's the context that I'll use to start. We're going to spend a little bit of time with the panel here, sort of exploring how they think about startups. They're trying to improve people's lives, startups that matter, engaging with local government, what local government perspectives are on startups of those kinds. Without further ado, I'll just say really briefly who the panelists are. I know you all for quite a while, so I'm doing this off of memory, but that'll give you a chance to introduce yourselves. Chris Murphy is an old friend of mine from working in the mayor's office in DC, and where he was chief of staff under Mayor Vincent Gray, and now he's part of the senior administration here at Georgetown. I don't actually know the name of your title, but we'll get there. But
it's long.
It's long. I'm sure it is, and you deserve it. Thanks for joining us. Matt Caywood is the founder or co-founder of Transit Screen, which is a 1776 member startup that is in the mobility space and engages with cities and local governments and other private and nonprofit parties really all around the world at this point. So thanks for joining us. And then David Burd, I haven't seen for a while, but we were friends back in Boston when we were both getting graduate degrees. And David has had an illustrious and varied career, but he now is a general manager for Uber in Baltimore. So this should be a fun conversation. So before we dive in, can I just let you guys, because I just gave a 10-second introduction. Can I just spend like 60 seconds each explain who you are, what you do, and particularly just put a little pinhole in areas that could be relevant for discussions about startups and local government.
Sure. Thanks, David, and thank you all for having us. Glad to be here. So just give you the 60-second version. So I spent most of my career in the federal government, and so I have more experience on the Hill and working for the feds, both at HUD and the agency that runs AmeriCorps. But I also ran a nonprofit for 8 years. So I think there's sort of two pieces of that are relevant. One is when you run a nonprofit, it's not unlike running a startup in that you have to be entrepreneurial every day. You're struggling to make payroll, you're mission driven, you're trying to recruit a small but mighty team to achieve a focus and a goal that you're all working towards. The federal side, though, is sort of where I sort of experience more of the regulatory side of government. And I think in some ways those two themes are what, when I was working with David in the mayor's office for 3 years, there's this sort of internal tension in your brain that you struggle with. Because on the one hand, you know that there's a regulatory framework in place that generally is meant to do good things. It's meant to sort of protect people, to prevent consumers from getting ripped off, to protect people's health, to protect a certain quality of service providing that's going on. At the same time, though, you do have this impulse around wanting to sort of facilitate the start of new businesses. You're very aware that the economy is changing rapidly, that it's a startup world. You want those startups to be in your city because they do all the things that David talked about in terms of promoting economic development. So there's a little bit of schizophrenia that cities, I think, have about startups, and I'm happy to continue sort of that theme as we go on tonight, if that helps.
Thank you. Matt, who are you? What have you done?
Okay. Most recently, as David said, I started Transit Screen, and what we do is we put real-time information on displays like the digital signs you have out there in the lobbies, mostly of buildings, and what information it is everything you need to make your next decision about how to get somewhere. So if you're going to DC, we've got bus, we've got bike share, we've got Uber. We'll tell you if Uber is surging or not. And so this is good for everyone.
It was early in the panel for that.
Yeah.
Too.
So pile on for Ubers until the second half of the discussion.
So we really try to bring all the information together into one place so that people can use it, and honestly, and so people's behavior can be influenced in ways that are positive, like not just assuming that you have to drive alone everywhere, and knowing that you have all these options around where you're going, day in and day out. And so I've been doing this for a little over 2 years now. Before that, I was actually kind of in the federal sector. That was what brought me to DC. I was working at a place called MITRE, which is like a federal contractor, so I have some experience with the pros and mostly cons of working with the federal sector. And I have a lot of, I think one thing that I should mention, and David will talk more about this, is that we've found it working with cities generally to be very beneficial relationship, mutually beneficial relationship, and some other types of governmental agencies much less so, and I think that's an interesting contrast.
Very good. Cool. David.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. I'm the general manager for Uber Baltimore and a good chunk of Maryland. Maybe I should start off just explaining what Uber is. There are good things about things that the folks sort of knowing all about what we do. So I've done, as David mentioned, I've done a bunch of things over the years. I've worked kind of the Obama campaign transition in government. I've worked at McKinsey in consulting. I actually worked at an energy startup a few years back that worked with city and state governments on energy efficiency. And I think through all of those things, including the work I do at Uber now, I think what animates me, I think what fascinates me is thinking about kind of how the sectors can work together to drive change. As I think about and have done work in Baltimore for Uber, and I know it's something we do across the world, it's thinking about not just how we can get provide opportunities for riders, opportunities for drivers, our partners, but also how we can work together with government, with the nonprofit community to enhance, to provide services, to impact people's lives. And I think that intersection of government, nonprofit, private sector is one that is only sort of more ripe over time and more robust to create change to enhance people's lives. So I'm excited to talk about those topics in more broadly.
Very good. So one thing I like about the mix here is, Chris, I'm just going to put the chief of staff for the city hat on you squarely for a lot of this conversation. But you have the city perspective. Matt, you're often selling directly into local government, right? Mm-hmm. And I've never heard of Uber selling to local government. Is that fair, David? You're really not.
Not
your thing. But that's actually an important split, I think, between ways in which startups engage with local government. You could be selling to it, or you could just be dealing with it, for lack of a better way of putting it. So let me start out just to paint the picture for those who may not have worked with government before, with the startup interfaces with local government. Chris, thinking back, and honestly, I can do this too with you, I was in the same place as you, but what kind of stuff did entrepreneurs engage the city about?
Well, I think there's two different ways that startups sort of approach the city. There's sort of the try to come in through the front door and shake your hand and brief you and let let you know that they're coming to your city. And you're usually sort of trying to figure out, okay, I've got 15 minutes for this before I have to run to my next meeting, so how is this relevant? Why should I care? What are they going to ask me for? Can I say yes? I mean, those are sort of questions you get asked. The second way you get is where a startup just comes and just plants their flag in your city and doesn't really tell you, maybe it doesn't occur to them that it's relevant, and they just sort of start doing business. And then at some point, typically there'll be some sort of intersection of your orbit with theirs, for good or for bad.
Is there a company you're thinking?
No. But so, and then you have to sort of figure out what to do in that moment, right? Is it, do you figure out how to work together? Is it adversarial? What's the nature of that relationship? So, I mean, I think there's those two ways.
Yeah, it's sort of a classic tension of permission versus forgiveness, right? Are you going to come in with a big hug to the city, or are you going to just come in, plant the flag, and then say, I'm here, forgive me, or deal with me, as the case may be?
Yeah. And I mean, we can, all jokes aside, we can talk candidly about it. I mean, I think in thinking about this question, I was thinking, if you're in an Uber and you can come into a city and you can if you're sort of, I don't know if you're not sort of membership, but you sign up for Uber. So if you're a startup that can pretty quickly scale up pretty quickly in a city, and you've got access to reach those people, then you've got a proven track record of mobilizing them, then I think it's a lot easier for you to ask for forgiveness than it is for permission. If you're more like, frankly, a General Assembly who sort of has to get approval from the state, DC counts as a city and a state, if you have to get approval from the state education authorizing body, and you can't really start until you get that, it's really hard for you to kind of generate this uprising to get people motivated. Then you've got to the pressure is on you to play a little nicer, to jump through the regulatory hurdles that traditionally folks that exist in regulated industries have to jump through.
And just to clarify, that was a real example you're setting with General Assembly and OSSI, or Office of the State Superintendent for Education, right?
Yeah, and what was great was, the OSSI people, or the General Assembly people would say, we love OSSI, they were great to work with, we work very quickly, we use them as a model, when we talk about other state education authorities. So there are examples where it works smoothly, so it can go smoothly.
That's fair. So, all right. So, David, I'm just going to go right, because we're just throwing all kinds of things in terms of our Uber around at this point. So, I think some people have the assumption that when it comes to Uber engaging with local government, the general attitude is, let's just throw some firebombs at City Hall, stand outside and wave, thumb the nose, and say, all right, what are you going to do about it? And I have a feeling that's probably not exactly what's written up in your playbook of how to engage with local officials. So tell us, how do you strategically think about it? In all seriousness, I think it was actually very strategic what Uber did coming to DC way back when, but and strategic what's happening in cities all around the world now. So tell us how you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we believe deeply in our product. We believe in the consumer choice empowerment, both opportunities for riders and for our driver partners. And I think our approach is let's grow, let's innovate, and let's work with government to make sure that there are rules that provide for that innovation, that foster that growth, that allow for that those opportunities. I think you see with Uber, and I think you see it in a lot of other new technologies, is that just government hasn't thought about a lot of these questions. The rules for taxi had been there for decades, and that was sort of the technology that existed. There were no rules that said here's how things could work if you can do it all on your iPhone or on your smartphone. When the rules were drafted, there were no smartphones. And so I think what you see is just, sort of cities grappling with, these new technologies, and frankly catching up with the technology that, the innovators, that folks that are, the entrepreneurs that bring these new ideas are coming up with. And I think as we think about it, it's how do we make sure we continue to grow to provide what we believe is a great service to both riders and our partners, but also, work with cities, work with state governments to make sure that there is a home for that innovation, and not just frankly a home for Uber, but a home for kind of the industry that we're helping to spawn, ride sharing.
So, but I want to push a little bit further on this, and if anybody has questions about this later, because Uber makes some strategic decisions to take a, let's say, in all seriousness, adversarial approach to working with cities. And I'll give you one personal example. I was in Montreal in August, and I took an Uber around town. I took an Uber. I remember when I hailed an Uber. I think it was Uber X, and the very polite Quebecois driver said, "If you don't mind, please come sit up in the front." And I asked why, and he said, "Well, Uber is actually illegal in Quebec. We're illegal. There's no federal law, but there's a Quebecois law that bans us. So if you sit up front, people just think I'm driving you like you're my friend. If you sit in the back, we could both get a ticket." So now I also know that there's other places like Spain where there's no Uber at all because of a federal law. So it's interesting that if there's a federal law prohibiting Uber will abide by it, from best I can tell. But at the local level, which is what happened in Montreal, Uber basically says, no, we're going to continue to provide the service. Why?
It's a great question. It's a big company, and I think to our credit, we really focus on kind of local cities and city-based teams. So essentially, each city, each state is really empowered to look at and think about the questions that are facing it and its business. With a lot of autonomy. I think one of the strengths of the company actually has been the city-based team that let us know the market well, and I think a lot of it's a really case-by-case decision. I think it's I don't think that there's sort of frankly hard and fast rules. I think a lot of it we look at it, we think about what the opportunity is, we think about what the risks are, and I think it's sort of all generally under the approach of we want to continue to expand. We believe deeply in what we do. And we try to work with governments as best we can. I think what you see in the states in the last year in particular is a real concerted effort to work with states to provide kind of framework statewide and to do whatever we can to sort of be that a partner to work together to educate lawmakers and rule makers to create homes. But I think I can sort of speak more informed way about Baltimore and Maryland, but I think it is for a case by case basis. Kind of balancing those competing sort of priorities, or those competing sort of kind of needs.
Well, here's a question both for you and for Matt. I think you talked about the importance of local officials. I think both of you want to have local advocates, let's say, people within government who, at various levels, I would imagine, who are going to be sympathetic to the Uber story, or for that matter, could get very excited about transit screening that. And try to open up doors to get you in on contracts or other opportunities there. I know that when I was in the mayor's office, Rachel Holt, who was leading the charge to get Uber legal in DC, saw me as one of her sort of like internal champions because I at least would listen to her. Not so sure what she thought of me.
No, I don't think that's
But so here's my question to you: is how do you go about? So first of all, do you take that as an active goal in a city that you want to expand into? What types of roles do you focus on, and how do you cultivate those kinds of advocates?
I mean, for us, I think it's actually a bit like you were saying, although a little bit different because we were really, as a startup, coming from scratch rather than some of these more established places that were sort of introducing a working model from city to city. It is part of our market entry strategy to work with and find advocates in city government. So, for instance, in DC. The first people we went to when we launched Transit Screen was DDOT, the Department of Transportation, and they actually became one of our first 3 paying clients, and they put Transit Screen up in all their offices, and gave us some nice anecdotes about how that was influencing people's people were using the circulators more, and the bike share and so on. Having a presence in the Department of Transportation, obviously, their mission is to make transportation work across the city. Our mission is to make it easier for people to get around, very aligned organizationally. But some of these other agencies that we ended up talking to, and these are actually ones that I think as we've entered more city by city markets have become more strategic for us, would be like, for instance, the departments of planning or the departments of zoning in different cities. So often it turns out that there are laws regulating new development projects in the city, and one of those laws, which is been under review in DC, but is how much parking you have to build for a particular commercial or residential development. Now, almost everyone agrees that these parking maximum laws are just saying way too high, saying the bar way too high. And it turns into a much higher cost because developers have to build a lot of parking that no one uses instead of residential apartments that people will actually live in. And as new mobility technologies come on, like Uber, it's no longer necessary to build those. But those laws are still there. So what do the cities do? They let the developers bargain with the city to do things that will make up for the lack of parking. And so some of those things might be they give away people metro passes, or they might pay for a bike share station, or they might also pay for a transit screening. And that kind of model where we work with the people who are planning developments in the city is one that we've been using in other cities, not just DC.
So a little bit, I want to go a little bit deeper into that. So Matt, are you saying that you are proactively trying to encourage these kinds of regulations, or are you being reactive and looking to see where they're on the books and having that dictate where you want to go next?
Yeah, so we didn't put in these parking minimum regulations, right? They came from the bad days of the 50s and urban renewal and deciding that everyone was going to drive everywhere in their own personal car and always needed to have a place to park it everywhere. And of course, the reality of it is that never worked, and we're dealing with a legacy of that right now. So we didn't put that in place, but we are looking at places where and frankly, those are also good markets for us because they're usually cities that have terrible transportation problems because their streets are small and choked with automobiles. So that's often a good indicator, I guess, of a market that will be one that we can work with, and it's one in which we have a natural conversation starter with a developer to say, hey, we can help you with this problem that you're going to face in doing your new development.
Fair. How do you think about which markets you want to go into?
So I think it's a little different. I think because we've seen Uber successful in all sorts of communities, urban, more remote, across the world and certainly across the U.S. I think we've tried to be everywhere. I think the motto is sort of as reliable as running water everywhere for everyone, and I think that's sort of our approach for some time. I think once you're in a market, it's a combination of a few things. I think first, it's sort of understanding the regulatory landscape. I think increasingly across the country, we're working with now a couple dozen states have passed sort of statewide legislation. So it's sort of from a regulatory perspective, it's understanding kind of where things are, educating lawmakers about what Uber is, how it's different, what we think are helpful policies to foster innovation and to allow this ride sharing kind of industry to grow up. Both on the legislative side and the regulatory side. I think from a city perspective, it's sort of, kind of going to what Matt said, it's just sort of thinking about kind of what your interests are, right? And so I think for Uber, for example, when we look at a city or a city government, for example, I think it's, we think we could be helpful from just a service perspective, whether it's providing rides that have been provided by for either for seniors or for the disabled folks. Being part of the transit conversation, right? So in Baltimore, they just announced a Baltimore Link program. We have some public transit, but it's not very good. And so being part of that conversation, knowing the right players at the city level, to be able to be in that conversation, think about like last mile programs where we can help folks get to public transit and other ways that we can be part of that transit solution. Or on the economic development side, we're always looking for more partners, more driver partners. And so talking, with economic development folks about, where are there opportunities and how we can help, both grow our business, but also be part of solving kind of, an unemployment challenge where people just need opportunities. So I think the broader lesson really is just, it's whatever your kind of, your startup is, whatever your idea is, think about kind of who in government could influence that, whether it's regulatory perspective, whether it's sort of a more kind of direct service contracting perspective, who can you partner with, who needs those services where you can be a good add-on, and I think it's never too soon. I think the benefit, going to your point earlier about kind of just the difference between sort of cities and states and the federal government, is that cities are focused on people, focused more locally, getting things done. And whether it's the smaller startup I was at before or Uber, you just get you get a sense working with the city that if you're a constituent, it matters to them. And so I think they're always open to hear from folks who are local about kind of the service or product you want to offer. And I think it's never too early to sort of have those conversations.
Yeah,
I feel like it can sometimes be too early. You talked about a bunch of conversations you had with people, or with startups who were either entering the market or who weren't talking to you and entering the market. You must have also had your share of conversations with people who were starting a company in the market and had no idea what they were doing in terms of asking you for anything or something.
So yeah, I think so I'll rephrase just to say that I think, by the time, when you do approach government, in fact, when you approach any partner, the idea is you should know what you want out of that conversation. You should know you should have enough sort of development of your idea to have a clear sense of sort of what you think the city could do for you and what you're looking for.
And we've been told not to give like general business advice, but I think this is specifically like important when it comes to meeting with cities and especially meeting with political leadership, because it's so tempting to take the meeting with governor whoever or senator whoever, even if you don't have an ask. It's like I just want the photo up. Well, maybe that's good, but maybe not.
So like you never should have met President Obama when he came.
No, that was a complete waste of time. I had
It's
to
a big
cancel.
photo of Matt with President Obama. when he
The
came
White
to
House keeps
77.
tweeting it out. I had to cancel an appointment with my accountant to make that one.
Yeah, I'm
So
sorry about that. So Chris, I'm curious, well, you may have thoughts on this, but I have a question for you.
Well,
too.
can I,
Please.
so,
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting, I think I have a slightly different take. I would say, unless your startup is directly related to government, either because it depends on government to exist, or you're certain that it involves regulation, I would stay away. I would stay away and I would do your thing. And then at some point, but be aware that there may come a time when you're kind of bumping up against government, and know that that's the right moment. And to your point, I couldn't agree more. When you get that moment, be clear what your ask is, right? Because there's nothing, no matter who you're meeting with, whether it's a funder or government or whomever, if you walk into that meeting and you walk out without the ask, it's an enormous waste of your time and their time. So, make sure you've got that ask, know what it is, and be ready to ask it.
Yeah, I think that's very right. And I think when I was thinking about kind of just approaching, I think it's more if what you do is directly related to government.
Absolutely, and,
right?
and it's built into
Yeah,
what you do.
exactly.
So yeah,
Like the startup I was at, and
yeah, I agree.
And by the way, you'd be amazed how often when you're in City Hall, you have meetings with startups and others where there is no ask.
Yeah,
It's like, I was shocked. When
and you look at the person and you think, why did we just?
why am I here?
Yeah.
I don't understand.
Yeah.
And I still don't understand,
Yeah.
actually. But looking back now, Chris,
Yeah.
with the perspective that you have, what made for a compelling pitch from a startup or a compelling presentation to you where they did want you to do something and you actually felt inclined to do it? What were some common themes?
Sure. I mean, I think the previous panel touched on this too. I mean, jobs is a big one. If it seems like this startup has legs, if it seems like it's sort of plugged in enough with its funding or with its model or whatever it is about, or just the people behind it that you just think, wow, these people are really good, they seem to know what they're talking about. If whatever it is gives you confidence that this thing might actually fly, and that it's going to be scalable, and that this could potentially result in large numbers of jobs for your city, you're on board. I mean, ideological stuff kind of goes out the window because you're really focused in a city on, are your people employed? Are you going to have people here who work here, live here, pay taxes? Are they going to be creating more jobs? So at that point, it just becomes a pure economic development play.
So you're saying it's a matter of traction, of number of jobs you already have, but also trajectory and even confidence in the leadership and in the trajectory there. I've always been curious about this. I mean, at what level, what size companies do you look at them and say, yes, this is now a jobs concern? Is it, it's probably not just the two founders or something, but is it 6 employees? Is it 15 employees? Is it 40 employees? Where do you get, just getting that mindset where you say this is a different conversation?
That's a great question. I think my gut says once you're at 15 and you say we've doubled in the last 6 months, you kind of go, wow, okay, well if they keep doubling every 6 months, you could do the math. That's pretty good. So I think, but it's also what you were saying, that it always isn't just that. Sometimes you hear the idea, or you kind of get the need instantaneously, or you see that they're funded by people who have a really good track record, that you sort of say, okay, these guys are for real. And certainly you meet folks that don't have those things, and you quickly say these guys are not for real.
Or that reflects a city priority, right? Like, for example, Mayor Gray had sustainability goals. correct?
Yeah.
And when there were startups that were plugged into those areas, those I know we were lucky to take meetings with them.
That's true, right.
Or I remember there was actually a startup that had only 2 employees at the time called Learn Zillion. It was an education technology startup that the mayor went out to welcome them into their new office, and that was because charter schools were a bit of a priority at the moment, and it was founded by a former charter teacher.
Yes, but my recollection is that what we announced was funding. Didn't they get a pretty decent round of funding? And I think it was kind of like they've arrived because they had been funded by
They
somebody.
barely arrived. That was a C round. But but that's actually a
There
good
was a
point.
hook.
There was a hook, and that's another
Yeah.
thing that local officials are looking for. This ties in with Jeff's earlier point about ribbon cuttings. Like, yes, ribbon cuttings are great, but that mentality can apply to things that are a lot less big than a ribbon cutting on a full building. It could be $1 million round.
Absolutely, you make them into a big thing.
Yeah, if it's a strategically aligned topic, it makes sense. Did you guys want to come in on this, or no? So question for you, Matt, because we're picking on David a lot about Uber, which I think is really appropriate. But I do want to ask you about just what the process is when you want to actually work with government and sell to government. First, before we go further, can you just pick an example, whether it's maybe Seattle or Montgomery County, just walk through a simple example of a startup that matters getting a contract with a local government.
And by that you mean us,
By you.
our experience.
Yes, your experience, Matt.
All right.
It's all about you.
Well, I can't speak for anyone else, but our experience with Montgomery County is probably a good illustration because it had a bunch of ups and downs. So we were working with DC a little bit. Yeah, we had some internal, screens up at DDOT, like I said, but we really didn't have a partnership with DC in terms of any sort of larger traction or any public-private partnership, or really DC pushing us in very many meaningful ways. So we got connected somehow, I can't remember exactly how, with Montgomery County because they had just appointed a chief innovation officer, which is, did you introduce us to Dan?
We introduced you to Ike Leggett when.
No, that was way after though. This is way before that,
Okay.
yeah.
I wanted to clarify that. Sorry, guys.
Yeah. So for the record, chief innovation officer, it's a new trend in cities, and in some ways it's supposed to be the guy or the girl who is the person who's the liaison to bring all this new technology into the city, talk to those entrepreneurs, and then put them in touch with the right people in the government. And usually the person is reporting in some fashion to the mayor's office, although maybe not all that often. So in theory. Now the problem is that generally, these people don't have a budget and they don't have much buy-in from the main sort of operations of the city. The Department of Sanitation is going to say, who is this chief innovation officer? Thinks he's fancy sitting up in the mayor's office. We know how to run our business. So there's a lot of problems with the execution in these models. A chief innovation officer or urban mechanics or what have you. But that's the idea. So we went to this guy. And it was apparent that we had a lot of ways to work together, and they were thinking of some pilot projects and this and that. And before we knew it, about 9-10 months had elapsed, and almost nothing had happened. And eventually, at that point, we were at 1776, very established among 1776 companies, so. The Montgomery County, this guy and and several council members and the county executive came by to tour the place and look for innovative companies here. Now suddenly, because we were 1776 had the partnership, it was almost like as if we were from Montgomery County because they had identified this as a priority to have this partnership. And so suddenly, between that and the personal visits and everything, stuff was happening. We were in, we were doing business with them, talking price. They, bought a bunch of our product and installed it very successfully in some of the county buildings and county service buildings as well, where they provide social services, which is another sort of, was very interesting for us because there's a need often for programs like this to be ones that affect the whole population of the county without respect to geography or social class. So as part of the sort of inclusive aim. So that turned into a real partnership with the county, and now, they're a client, and we're doing a lot of business with them. And we had a great launch with the county executive up in Rockville, which turned into we got some press out of that and so on.
It's a good article in Washington City paper about it, if you're curious.
Yeah, I was not at that event. I was actually stuck in an elevator during that. So yeah, it just, that's how it worked out. I guess that someone should modernize the Department of Elevators in whatever city that was. But the point is, long trajectory, long sales cycle. I mean, when people talk about cities and governments having a long sales cycle, they're often not kidding. But if persistent and with the right, especially with the right relationships, it can turn into a really fruitful partnership.
And you said something about how cities are better than some of the other clients that you have.
Well, I'm being a little bit provocative there, but I think this is really speaking to what you said earlier, which is that cities are focused on solving problems. And if the problems are like, for instance, the problem that when you go to the metro station, you often don't find out when the metro is leaving until you're on the platform, and there's a sign that tells you that. That doesn't make any sense. The metro long ago should have put signs up above the entrances displaying all of the transit information you need, and heck, even telling you how to not take metro if metro is totally broken, because that's how you do customer service, right? But so we, in some parts with working with the city, we've actually kind of worked around that problem which is a problem of metros. But metro is this, obviously, if you guys read the newspapers, there's, complex, multi-jurisdictional place that has lacked leadership for the last year or so, and now they have a new general manager, so maybe they're poised to change. But, the fact that even the city was saying, how can I solve this problem that this other government agency is creating for our residents, is, I think, a testimonial to the fact that cities are places where things can and do get done.
It just takes time.
Yeah.
All right. We're moving toward the point in the program where I get questions from you guys, so start thinking about it. But first, David, what's the biggest pain point for you in dealing with local government?
I think from a regulatory perspective, I would say I think we're really working towards moving at the state level, and I think part of it is just sort of education and time. I think at a local level, when it's more programmatic, it's same. It's just time. I mean, I think it's sort of our core business is just sort of riders and drivers and continue to grow. I think there could be some interesting ways we work together on programs at a city level. But I think same. It takes a long time to work for things to be announced.
So let me pick up on that though for a second, because I think one thing we haven't really touched on is how Uber's strategy towards dealing with local governments, and including state governments, has really evolved, right? Because it did come in. Uber came in with a very clear legal theory of your regulation doesn't apply to us, so we get to do what we want and leave us alone. And when local government would step in and say, no, we think what you're doing actually is under the regulations, they would say, nope. Over time, that has evolved. And I think in part it's because you've ended up having some decent relationships. And it's funny, I remember I was on a panel with Rachel about a year ago, and Rachel, your predecessor, and I were sort of pretty adversarial for a long period of time. Well, we ended up getting to a pretty good place, and we were on a panel, and Rachel actually said, we actually now point to DC as a model for how you can work with local jurisdictions. And I kind of laughed, because it was sort of, you would not have predicted that, the 2 years before that moment. So it's also just an interesting example of where, and Uber, as the situation evolves and Uber says, okay, maybe we are willing to work with you, then you get down into the weeds and you get into details and say, well, what does it mean to be regulated? What are you going to require us to do? The city said, we want you to do these sorts of things. And initially it was, no, we're not willing to do that. And then you sort of start figuring out, well, where are the votes? Are we going to win that? Are we going to lose that? And eventually you get to a pretty good regulatory scheme in DC, at least, that you could live with, that then you can sort of shop around to other jurisdictions and say, look, we've done this in DC, just copy what they're doing, or I'm sure you have other model cities. And then you've got sort of a template that you then sell, but it certainly was a far way from where you initially started.
Yeah, and let me talk more to that, because I think sort of as you think about kind of Uber and government, I think that's sort of the more classic example of sort of how we work with governments. And I think you're right. I mean, I think you mentioned earlier on that Starting out, if you can grow your business, you believe deeply in your business without sort of needing to work with government, you do. And I think early on we were seeing sort of tremendous growth, and the regulations that existed we didn't think kind of applied to the technology that we had. I think that over time, though, I think you're right. We've seen kind of more of taken a much more active approach as we realize just how integral it is to work closely and get these kind of regulatory frameworks established with government. And I think first it was at cities and cities like DC. I think then increasingly it was at states at the state level, and I think now about 24 states we have sort of statewide frameworks. But you're right. A lot of it's then hammering out kind of what do we think is right? What do we think the right answer is given the technology? And again, I really do think a lot of it's just education. I think folks, when you're working, in this room, most people have Uber or have used Uber. If you go to a room of lawmakers or regulators, that's not always the case. And so I think it's sort of it's educating folks, it's understanding kind of and coming to a balance between kind of growth and safety and the other considerations that cities have.
But let's be clear about what happens when you make some of these state frameworks, as you call them. I was just in Nashville, Tennessee, a few weeks ago. In Nashville, I was shocked. It was the most rideshare friendly airport I'd ever seen. There's actually a whole rideshare section of the airport, along with taxis and limos and everything else. Uber everywhere, Lyft also everywhere. And I asked someone, I said, wow, the city really has jumped on board wholesale. You know why? Because Uber, and a little bit Lyft, but mainly Uber, got the state to enact legislation at the state level that bans any local city, which basically means Nashville, Memphis, maybe a little bit of Chattanooga and Knoxville, but mainly Nashville, Memphis, from enacting any restrictions whatsoever on rideshare. So if you are the mayor of Nashville, you can't do anything. So it doesn't matter whether we have a great relationship on the mayor of Nashville or we have a terrible relationship. I can't do anything about you because you've just gone around the local government and created a state framework.
Yeah. And I think what you see there is, I think what you see affecting a lot of, an interest of a lot of businesses, which is certainty and the ability to operate. I think.
Yeah, that's fair, David. But do you really think that means that local governments are going to embrace you with open arms when they see that Uber sometimes takes that approach at the state level?
But I also think cities are part of that conversation as well. When state legislation passes, all sorts of interests are at the table having the conversation. And yeah, I think ultimately, as a business, what's important is having sort of certainty, being able to administer, administrability, and not having sort of all these sort of frameworks kind of pop up across the state. And I think so. What we've been doing, is working with states, but obviously as part of that conversation, cities are always involved. Other interests are always involved to get to sort of hammer out kind of what that ultimate framework is.
I mean,
Matt, do you want to come in?
I probably shouldn't jump on this one, but I think there's an important thing which hasn't been discussed, which is regulatory capture, and I don't mean at the state level, but I mean the cities are often, because it's so local, they're often captured by the industries that they regulate. And in this case, I think it's actually reflects to Uber's credit that they've decided that the cities often have a relationship with the taxi cab. The taxi fleets, and especially the medallion owners in a lot of cities who are big, financiers, who that they have just made it impossible to work with the cities at a regulatory level. So they decided, like in San Francisco originally, that they were going to go appeal to the state to be regulated at that level, which is a higher level, that can override the cities. So I think, and that's something I think that maybe is obviously regulatory capture happens everywhere. It happens in the Defense Department, but it happens at cities fairly often, I think, and it's definitely a risk.
Yeah, I've often thought that if Uber tried to do what it did 10 years earlier, when the taxi industry was much stronger as a political force, it probably couldn't have done it. But the world had changed so much in 10 years because of, I think, social media and sort of the power of using social media. I think it created that, and the fact that the DC taxi industry had continued to sort of just get worse and worse. I think it created an environment where Uber could do what it did.
And I think just to
last point.
Now because I think one of the points that I think we potentially we're going to touch on is just this notion of sort of engaging consumers, engaging residents to speak. and to sort of, to move lawmakers. And I think, one view is, stomping your feet and sort of just, getting folks to sort of, kind of direct their ire at elected officials. But I think, if you believe in democracy and little d democracy, this is sort of the epitome of, having, constituents' voices heard. And I think it's sort of a new approach that you're seeing more and more in that process as you iron things out, whether it's at city level or state level, engaging the consumers to sort of to reach out to their elected officials.
That's certainly what you see with Airbnb, which what they just did in San Francisco, beating back that ballot initiative, and they're trying to organize in like 50 different cities, groups of Airbnb renters to be able to lobby government as appropriate. Frankly, I think it's a playbook out of it.
And when you think about it, in the past it was sort of special interests, lobbyists who have sort of the ear of legislators, but now you're really empowering people. And I think there's actually something sort of quite democratic about that.
Truly last point.
Okay, I just want to make this point, and it actually circles back to something I was saying at the beginning, though. I think we have to be careful there, not for Uber. I mean, you guys, sort of, you have your business model and you go for it, so I don't begrudge you that at all. But I think as a observer, sort of, thinking critically about these issues, I think you have to be careful about thinking about, Uber has its thing. It wants to do its thing. It wants minimal regulation. Every business wants minimal regulation. Fine. But don't forget why government regulates to begin with, right? So, everyone loves Uber until something goes wrong with an Uber driver, right? And then they say, who do they come to? Do they come to the Uber? Kind of, but who do they really come to? They really come to the government. And they say, why didn't you regulate them, right? Why didn't you make them do background checks? And so when people, for the first phase of Uber, when everybody's loving it, and it is a great service, I use it myself, it's a great service, I have no complaints, but you don't think about, when you get in somebody's car, you don't really think, you're just like, this is so cool, you're not thinking, geez, is this person had a background check on them? Because I kind of hope so. So yes, I respect the small d democracy point, but there's also, it's admittedly a bit of a paternalistic point, but that's part of the reason we, under John Locke's rules, have decided we want government, right? Because there's some benefit to having kind of a collective action there. There's a reason that regulatory exists. It's not just to sort of impede startups from doing great things. It actually is there for a good reason. Now, can it sometimes go too far and get outmoded in 1958 zoning codes that aren't really relevant to do this? Absolutely it can. But, go back to the first principles behind regulation.
I'm just glad that the startup conversation somehow got John Locke involved. Let's
let me throw in one real
Yeah.
quick. And it's the same question I asked the last panel. The role of money in politics happens in city government too. Donors, a lot of business people give money to elected officials in DC, mayors, council members, people running for office. Current mayors may or may not set up political committees to raise lots of money and then shut them down. There's lots of money flowing through here. And a lot of businesses invest. They put money in. They must think they're getting something out of it. How do entrepreneurs deal with that? And how do startups deal with that? And what have you guys seen? I know two of you were in the mayor's office not too long ago. How did money buy influence from you? How much did it cost?
It was pretty expensive for me. This was cheaper. No, in all honesty, I'll answer this one because I did deal with probably more. I was the main point of contact for most startups interfacing with the city when I was there, and almost none of them could afford a lobbyist. Almost none of them could afford really any way of engaging with us. The only exception, in a substantive way, was Living Social. When Living Social was at the point of being mega capitalized at the hundreds of millions of dollar level from Amazon and from Revolution, and they actually retained Home Tonight, the big DC lobbyists, to push for a big incentive package, which we negotiated, and which, for the record, they never received $1 from. It was entirely performance-based, everyone should know that. But to be honest with you, the issues of money in local government are important, and the stuff with the PAC recently is a really critical issue. I'll be honest with you though, Jeff, startups by and large can't afford to throw a whole lot of money.
But the companies, like the taxi industry traditionally did put a lot of money in, right? Sometimes
But that's exactly, I'll let you respond to that. Go ahead.
No, look, I think we have to be careful there because I think you have to be careful about painting with too broad a brush, right? Because politicians are different, right? People are different. So I'm sure there are politicians that are more susceptible to that sort of thing. Mayor Gray wasn't. Frankly, if you were gonna spend money, it would be to go to a fundraiser to spend a little time with them, right? So they get to kind of know you, so that when you see them the next time, they remember you. I would say that's money better spent than, trying to make some big other
But
campaign.
to Jeff's point, the taxis had a lot of money, and they had a lot of
But
lobbying.
the taxi's power was actually never through money. It was through campaign, because it was bumper stickers that they could, and they would take people to the polls for free. It wasn't about money.
That's true.
So, but yes, that's the tax. There are
Jim
other
Gray got
industries.
busted, right? Or his chief of staff got busted taking money from the.
For Jim Graham, yeah, but I wouldn't say.
That wasn't necessarily common.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll stop now. You guys can go on.
Just one thing that I heard, I was up in New York an event recently, and this guy, Bradley Tusk, I don't know
Yeah,
if you guys know the name.
Yeah.
He's, I believe his consultancy was responsible for the de Blasio mode, or as in
He
some
claims
ways,
it.
he says it and Uber has denied it. But anyway, he said, something which I thought was very interesting, which is that, there's startups and there's startups, right? And if you're a small startup and you're working with the city and you're working against entrenched interests, then you can play we have clean hands. We're new, we're fresh, we're not part of the old political guard. We're not looking for some corrupt handout. But he said, if you do that, you absolutely cannot give anyone any money ever, because then you're just falling right into the trap. So you either have to just totally stay out of the money game, or you have to be prepared to actually go in.
All right, let's get some questions here.